Great. So thank you to the organizers and to everyone today for having us be part of this increasingly important conversation. I wanted to focus on something very specific on internet voting, so I'll take up hopefully not a lot of your time, but really just wanted to cover some considerations that we think are important because increasingly calls for internet voting are being raised as an alternative to in-person voting in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it's important to ask some serious questions when you're implementing any new technology, particularly internet voting, to make sure that you're being responsible and taking into account the feelings of the public, as well as feasibility and security. As Stefan mentioned, we also recently released a paper on considerations on internet voting, an overview for election management, which is available on the IFES website, which we're happy to point you towards. It's being translated into a few languages right now. So I think it's in Ukrainian already. And oh yeah, and to introduce myself, I'm Meredith Applegate. I'm the program advisor for IFES in Ukraine. So just to start the discussion about internet voting, we think it's important to look at it across 5 main parameters and ask questions related to those. So what is the actual cost of implementing internet voting? Will internet voting improve participation? Will internet voting make the voting and counting process more efficient, including the dispute process? Will the public trust the results of an election held through remote internet voting? And is there adequate security in place? So first, will internet voting save money? I would be very skeptical of some of the claims that you hear. It's very difficult to measure how much internet voting actually costs because so many countries like Estonia, which is the only country that currently has nationwide internet voting, have invested over decades in IT infrastructure that make it more possible to hold voting online and remotely. Beware of the hidden costs and also the fact that having internet voting won't lower costs when it comes to training. It may actually increase it in the first stage. So if you look at cost savings, they would be much more long term. And I think what a number of the colleagues have said, including Septimius, is that changes based on COVID-19 to the election process itself and how people are voting need to be very cautiously considered. Things like internet voting and new election technology take an extremely long time to properly implement, including piloting and testing and other training factors. So if you're looking at a quick solution to the pandemic and voting in person, internet voting is probably not it unless you're one of the countries that has been already looking to implement this over a long period of time. Turnout, however, is one of the arguments for internet voting in a lot of contexts. When you look at it outside of the pandemic, and you look at like Norway, for example, it's interesting to find that there was actually no impact noted in terms of voter turnout. What they found was they were expecting, a lot more young people to vote because the option to vote online was available, but they didn't actually see the increase that they were anticipating. Rather, people had the same concerns usually whether or not there was an internet voting option, which is why should I vote at all? Why should I care? And now I think it's talking to voters about why should they vote in the time of the pandemic and how can they feel safe? So it's really about messaging when it comes to turnout, which I know several of my colleagues have covered very well today. There are some options in terms of accessibility for internet voting that might be appealing to some demographics. But all of the turnout considerations have to be weighed holistically with other factors as well before you determine that this is the direction that you want to take as an EMB. In terms of efficiency, it's very important when you're considering any type of election technology to look at the level of IT literacy and the infrastructure available in your country, what would need to be supplemented, as well as the legality and necessary amendments to the legal framework. So when you're looking at the new technology, such as internet voting, you'd have to take into account what your legal framework says about the access for observers, for audit trails, and also verifiability. So thinking about how we hold elections now, making sure that if there are disputes, there's still an ability to audit how votes were cast. So a voter themselves can check to see that their vote was cast as they intended. And then an outside person can also verify that votes are being cast and counted as they were intended. Public trust and perception, I think, is critical now more than ever. So considering public perception, and I think as all of the electoral colleagues who are on this call already know, the perception of fraud or the perception that an election has been tampered with can often be just as damaging as actual fraud or actual tampering. So even in contexts where there's a belief that there might be a lot of public support. So in Ukraine, we ran a public survey, and 30% of Ukrainians support internet voting, but only 26% think that voting on the internet is safe. So once you start to drill down, you can see some of the cracks emerge in terms of public trust and perception, and the work that you'd have to do on increasing that trust before you can safely hold internet voting and have people think that results are legitimate. And the final thing to take into account is security. Before undertaking internet voting or introducing any new electoral technology that utilizes the internet, you should undertake a full security risk assessment, looking at a variety of potential points of vulnerability. So with internet voting, a voter itself would be a potential point of vulnerability if the voter has, for example, a virus on their own device. But you'd also have to look at what if an election official takes a USB card from another unknown source and puts it into the machine that they're using. So you have to look at all of these variety of different points in order to have a really robust security plan in place. Personal security as well is important. So one of the things that's raised often, which also applies to postal voting, is coercion. So having a polling station, having people travel to a polling station allows there to be some sort of oversight when a voter is casting their ballot. And when you're doing this remotely, it's much more likely that a voter could be coerced or feel pressured. I'm thinking, for example, if there's domestic violence in the home, you could find one person pressuring another to vote in a specific way without the benefit of external oversight. And internet voting does not solve this problem at all. So voter secrecy, voter identification, these are all things that will still need to be considerably worked on before it can be launched on a broad scale. And then just to show you where the paper can be found on ifes.org if you want to read anything further on these parameters and some other considerations. So thank you, and I'll hand it over for the discussion.